He'll be facing off against a name you also might recognize, Dan Jordan, the champion from Grand Prix Charlotte, or sorry, not Grand Prix, pardon me, from Star City Games Open Series Charlotte and from Star City Games Open Series Boston.
Yeah, back last time I was here.
The other two players we have in our top 8, also no slouches. I'll start with the one that has a little bit more we've seen him more this weekend, Edgar Flores. This is his 6th top 8.
I think Edgar has reached the level on the Star City Open Series where he gets, if it's like 9 rounds, he gets 9 buys. If it's 10 rounds, he gets 10 buys. And
right.
He just shows up in the top 8.
And his opponent for the match will be Devin March, who this is his first top 8 in a Star City Games Open Series, but he has been, we'll call it the bridesmaid.
Right.
He's gotten ninth in 2 Star City Games Open Series, the first in Richmond and the next in LA. And that was actually, one was Legacy and one was Standard.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I didn't realize that. I thought they were both standard.
No.
Me making assumptions.
The other people that did not make the top 4, Drew Levin, AJ Soccer, and Adam Chambers. Now, you might recognize the first few names pretty easily just from Star City Games website, but Adam Chambers, 2nd place, Pro Tour Atlanta. Now, the odd person out here, Lawrence Swayze, playing a Simic aggro deck, didn't make it, and he did get 2nd place last time here in Boston. Let's go to the action on the board. Dave Shiels wins the die roll and is the first to act, getting a Stoneforge Mystic. Dan Jordan on the other side of the table getting a Stoneforge Mystic. And now these players both realize they can't quite interact with each other at this point in the game, and so they both are just searching at the same time.
Yeah.
There you see Dan Jordan, and of course Dave Shiels is now wearing his green hooded Jace outfit.
Yeah, he's green Jace.
Yeah, yesterday he had his Abercrombie Jace outfit on.
Yeah.
But he has to always make sure he has the hood. We did notice that when Colosso Fuentes took down his hood,
all sorts of problems.
yeah, he lost.
Yeah,
he lost.
Put the hood back up doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
Disrespect
once you
the
take
hood.
down the Jace hood, Jace does not give you the love anymore.
Yeah.
So both of these players both got Sword of Feast and Famine, and now we're going to turn 3 for David Shiels.
Yeah, so this is actually something we were sort of just discussing. I haven't seen both players' hands, but it looks like they both have a pretty good start. We were just discussing this with KYT of ManaDeprived.com. He's been playing Callblade, and he was asking us, do we think it's all about the skill in the mirror, or does it still have to come down to luck? And here we have 2 players that look like they have pretty much a great opening hand.
Right. Squadron Hawk from David Shiels gets Squadron Hawk. Comes into play tap land over there. Looks like a 2nd Celestial Colonnade. And, interestingly, one of the things I'm very curious to see is David Shiels has a particular approach to this mirror that most people that are doing well with this are very, very ponderous. They're very conservative. And David Shiels is, oh, look at this. Dan Jordan missing a land drop.
Uh-oh.
That's problematic
That
in the extreme.
That may be the catalyst right here already on turn 3.
But yeah, Dave Shiels' approach is kind of a traditional but conservative play approach. And in the other bracket, Edgar Flores, who has a radical different build on this deck with 3 Condemn and 3 Oust main, as well as no Gideons, no Days, no Into the Royals, no Tumble Magnets, and 1 to 2 less land depending on what his opponent might be playing.
Yeah, he's got the rogue deck of the one.
Yeah, so the thing is that Edgar has a very aggressive take on it. I would be excited to see, no offense to Dan or Devin, but I would be excited to see David and Edgar in the finals just to see whose philosophy might have an edge.
Yeah, and watching Flores, he's one of the most deliberate players I've seen. Like where his, there we go with a Sword of Feast and Famine.
Right.
Wow.
Scalding Tarns makes an island, and then we get a Sword of Feast and Famine from Stoneforge Mystic onto the Squadron Hawk. That will be untapping the land after taking a hit on Dan Jordan's hand.
So does Jace come down here?
I don't think so. I think that he plays it ponderously and conservatively here, right?
Because I think he could just run it right into a mana leak, but which he does not want to do.
And Dan decides discards. Looks like a sword.
Yeah.
Wow. That is a Sword of Feast and Famine, discarded to the yard. And David does a post-combat preordain.
Yeah, it's kind of like a mini Jace.
For those of you who are just joining us, this is the semifinals. David Shiels working on a potential 45-match winning streak. and Dan Jordan looking to bring home a third championship in the Star City Games Open Series. Here goes a Tumble Magnet, and he just scoops it up once that's spell pierced.
Yeah.
He's like, he knows how far behind this is.
Yeah, so he hit his third land drop, tried to drop a Tumble Magnet, and David had the spell pierce for it, which is pretty much, you know, his only hope was that Tumble Magnet, and didn't work for him there. But now they're gonna go to sideboard, and we will be giving out some more Star City Games Premium.
That's right.
In this case, we're giving out 6 months of free Star City Games Premium. I've got a question.
Okay, why don't we hear it?
And if you've been listening in the past few minutes, you may have heard. You should have heard the answer. What planeswalker is conspicuously missing from Edgar Flores's list today? From his main deck. What planeswalker is conspicuously missing from Edgar Flores's main deck? Now, obviously, he's not playing Sorin, but I think everyone knows it's a Caw-Blade staple that Edgar decided not to play. So if you tweet that with hashtag SCG Premium, you could win 6 months of free premium. And Adrian is typing it up for Twitter here. Sorry, I worded it awkwardly for you, Adrian. Trying to clean that up for us. So yeah, unfortunately, it looked good for both players there in Game 1 at first. As of turn 2, both players with the Stoneforge Mystics, but Dan missing that third land drop, as I suspected, that was the catalyst. That was the turning point right there. Also, and I was going to point it out, but it didn't end up being relevant, was David had a Tectonic Edge in play as well. So even if Dan hit his fourth land drop, it was possible that he was going to stall out again as soon as, you know, having one turn with 4 lands, and that was going to be it for him. David smelling blood in the water. Knowing that Dan was hurting for lands, I think wouldn't have hesitated to Tectonic Edge if he thought that was going to keep Dan off his game.
One of the things to note about Dan Jordan, the consensus for a lot of players, and we saw this play out in events like the Grand Prix, is that Rug has an advantage over Caw-Blade. Which is really curious here that Dan Jordan is playing Caw-Blade, because Dan Jordan, his previous 2 championships with the Star City Games Open Series have been with Rug, and he has stepped away from Rug in order to play Caw-Blade. And now you would imagine that if Rug had a great matchup versus Caw-Blade, maybe he would just keep playing Rug. He knows the deck. He's won 2 of these Star City Games Open Series. But no, he has switched over to Caw-Blade. And I know that a lot of the top players here think that, just in general, the Caw-Blade deck, even if an excellent player with an excellent build is playing Rug, that if they have an edge, it's so small, it's not worth it based on the edge you have against the rest of the field if you play Caw-Blade.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's something to be said for just the fun factor, and if you're consistently playing the same deck and you decide, you know, I just want something different, and I'll just choose the other big deck in the format, you know, he just wanted to try something new maybe, and he's obviously a good enough player to capitalize on the strength of his deck.
I mean, I guess I almost feel like just the way that Dan plays, watching him play at several of these events now, I almost feel like it would be as though, let's pretend that blue-white control were arguably the best deck. If Shaheen Surani showed up and didn't play blue-white control, yeah, I'd be like, what's up?
Right,
and
and
Dan Jordan it's that same kind of thing.
Right.
If Michael Jacobs showed up and he was not playing Rug, I would be like, "What's up?" And Dan Jordan, I think, in many ways, it treats Rug like Michael Jacobs treats Rug.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a very good analogy, I think. And I definitely, when I see the name Dan Jordan, I immediately think of Rug. So yeah, that does seem to be, I guess it is an interesting thing that he decided to switch, especially given the strength of the Rug deck.
Yeah. Okay, we get our new hands for David and Dan, and David goes back, putting those back in there. I get a shuffle up.
So
for long time Magic players, they will recognize that when you have a matchup like this, Obviously, mulliganing is never good, but traditionally in blue-white matchups, the mulligan is not too dangerous, just because there's often enough time. And particularly in the Clawblade mirror, as long as you don't mulligan too far down, a single Squadron Hawk can undo all the damage.
Yeah, the unmulligan. Yeah. And note David is on the draw here, so.
Now, I know that almost all of the players that have made this top 8, one of the things that they've been saying when we've had a chance to talk to them is about how skill-intensive the matchup is. And I know that when we had our visit here, he was saying, oh, well, maybe the good players are just mulliganing better. And because of the forgiving nature of the mulligan for this deck, it's not as forgiving as Dredge. Perhaps just knowing how to make those mulligans that are a little bit more enticing, like, keep this hand, and you go on like, nah.
Yeah.
Not good enough. That could be a part of the reason why these guys are up here.
That's a huge part of the game, I think, that both players leading with a Celestial Colony.
Okay, turn 2 for Dan Jordan, Stoneforge Mystic. And he's allows David to begin his turn.
Yeah.
He probably has already verbally announced what he's getting. David...
Same play.
Same play.
This is looking very similar to last game.
This is essentially the last game in reverse. We've got a Inkmouth Nexus and a Celestial Colonnade for Dan Jordan, and an Island and a Celestial Colonnade for David Shiels.
Both players with a Stoneforge Mystic and a Sword of Feast and Famine in hand. Well, so Stoneforge Mystic on the board and a sword in hand. Yeah, I think one of the hardest things about playing, once you're trying to play at a more competitive level, it's kind of deceptively difficult, is the mulligan decision.
Okay.
All right, you got me.
And a Squadron Hawk from
now
Dan.
he attacks for 1 there. Now you might think that David Shiels would block that, but the fear of a Mortar Pod killing off the Stoneforge Mystic keeps him from doing so.
Right.
So 1 point of free damage for Dan Jordan.
I would have expected Dan to hold his Mystic back to drop a sword, but
Now, one of the things that's a line of play that has been talked about is the more aggressive line of play that looks like Dan is going with. Now, obviously, you can change modes pretty rapidly with this deck depending on how things play out. Some people, if you're really particularly good at your deck, changing modes is something you can definitely do. Mode changing, as in going from an aggressive deck to a more controlling deck, is one of the hardest things to do in Magic, but it can be done if you know how to do it. David Shiels casts Preordain, not laying a land yet. He could be just trying to draw out a counterspell, or maybe he just doesn't have that land. Those 2 cards he's seeing with the Preordain, neither of which are land. It's a Preordain and a Spell Pierce, and he's kind of looking at them pretty carefully, so probably he has a land in his hand. Looking at his hand there, I'm not sure that he does. Some thinking back and forth. Nope, he bottoms them both. Perhaps looking for that land. And is it going to be a reversal of the last one? I see a Condemn. I don't know that I see a land.
no, I don't know.
Oh, there is one. Okay, Scalding Tarn was sneaky.
He was hiding between 2 Condemns, I think. And it's like a second Stoneforge Mystic, 2 Condemns, a Sword of Feast and Famine, and 2 cards I couldn't quite see.
Is that a Squadron Hawk?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
there's
it's
a
2
Hawk.
Squadron Hawks, actually. I think he had 2 in hand.
Now, you can see right here, one of the things that is definitely being positioned for, on the next turn, one of the things that can happen is that with the 4th land and a Squadron Hawk that is not summoning sick, that means that with the 4th land, Dan can put a equipment into play and put it on an active Hawk and attack.
Right.
So that's what this line of play opens up for him, is that possibility.
Yeah, I think that's we saw that happen in the last game, but in this case, both players are looking like they have reasonable positions.
Getting the first Hawk is so important. One of the fights you often see in this matchup is just for that first Hawk.
Yeah.
And there we go, the play we talked about a moment ago, putting the 4th land into play, equipping the Squadron Hawk after dropping the sword into play with the Stoneforge Mystic. It's probable that this Hawk might block, but there is the opportunity, if David has a land in particular, that he might just take the hit and then try to do the same in return.
Right.
Now that's a little bit dangerous because obviously Dan Jordan will be able to untap and do some more work.
Right.
But at the same time, just throwing away a Hawk when you've got so few resources is also hard.
Yeah, so he decides to jump
He
off.
does. That's the most likely play here, just because of the mana situation.
Yeah, I mean, if he had taken it, that would have given Dan a huge opportunity,
Right.
and then even if David managed to try to do the exact same kind of thing that Dan did, it's just kind of like he's a turn behind Dan doing all the powerful plays. So
From there we see Dave Shiels with the Seachrome Coast coming to play tapped, and a Hawk just dropping it into play as a chump once again. Now obviously Dan Jordan was he was representing for Mortarpod. If a Mortarpod were to hit right now, that would be pretty devastating.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was that. I'm more than capable. Just forget. Oh, I'm sure it was that.
And note, David's land was a Seachrome Coast, so it came into play tapped. So I'm not sure if he has another option as far as his land drop that turn, but that may have been why he didn't decide to let the bird in, or at least contributing to that decision.
No Mortarpod. In comes the Hawk.
So right now David only has Island up, so no fear of a condemn from David. And looks like it got in.
Looks like it did before combat. He's like, no, wait a second.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm not going to attack after all. Not yet. I want to cast this card first.
I was going to say, if that got in, why is David at only 8?
It's like, okay, now I'm going to attack. Now I'm going to attack.
So yeah, no fear of the condemn from David. No reason to worry about that. That may be what Dan was even thinking. Like, well, he's not going to kill this bird, so he's either got to chump block it or take it. So things are looking pretty good for Dan right now.
David is looking at his hand here, thinking about a potential discard. Yep. And again, in this case, just wants to preserve that that creature that he has in play. There is a Tectonic Edge taking care of a Celestial Colonnade. You'll note that he's still completely untapped. That's a triggered ability that happens there. So he can, once the trigger is on the stack, be like, okay, well then I'm gonna Tectonic Edge you.
Yeah, so I can untap the land that I used to pay for the Tectonic Edge.
David Shiels takes a draw. Looks like he drew another land.
Yeah, I think it's a Glacial Fortress. So he's got Fortress, Condemn, Stoneforge Mystic, Sword of Feast and Famine, and I think a Squadron Hawk.
I think you're right.
You know what we're doing.
Pretty sure he's got another Hawk in hand. There's the other Stoneforge Mystic. Definitely has Condemn, and a Sword, so I think that's everything.
Now, one of the things that's kind of a little bit counterintuitive is the power of a card like Condemn in this matchup. And interestingly, how Condemn is much less powerful for a blue-white control deck in this matchup. And part of it is that Condemn, you put the Squadron Hawk to the bottom, and then they just get it again, so it's like you lose a card, and that's terrible. But a lot of this matchup is about positioning. Now, for a blue-white control deck, throwing away that card is actually a big deal. But for this matchup, the positioning matters. We've got a mana leak here to try to stop the second Mystic from David Shiels.
Which
he's like, okay, you got me.
It's gonna work.
You got me.
So now David has to rely on those Condemns if he wants to defend. I think the play that he was going for there was actually going to be Mystic, get Mortarpod, drop Mortarpod into play with the, when on Dan's turn, drop it into play with a Stoneforge Mystic and then sacrifice it. So basically doing something similar to what the Condemn was going to do. At least that may have been, he was at least keeping that line of play open, but Dan puts a stop to that with Mana Leak.
And there we have a Glacial Fortress from Dan Jordan.
Which comes into play tapped, interestingly enough.
2 mana. Another Hawk. It's the third Hawk.
And in with my Bird and Sword,
Nope.
says Dan.
Opportunity to potentially condemn here.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Condemning, though, does he goes for the discard instead, because it does mean that he does not have the 2 mana to be able to activate his Stoneforge Mystic.
Right. So he's going to move the sword.
There it is.
Mid-air pass off there between the Hawks.
End of the turn, down comes a sword from David Shiels. Now, one of the things that's really good here is David's willingness to take a hit. Now, it's not good to be hit by a Sword of Feast and Famine, but it's worse to fight over being not hit by it when you don't have to.
Right. That's a very interesting decision there, and I think I know personally, if I were in David's position, I'd be doing everything I could to not get hit with that sword, and I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It seems like such a powerful ability. You find yourself like by instinct just wanting to avoid getting hit with it, but I think there's something to be said for letting yourself get hit.
Yeah, Preordained displays to David a Gideon and another card I can't quite make out. He draws a Tectonic Edge, that's the other card. So there's a Gideon on top of his library. And there's a 5th land with 4 up. He's in pretty good shape here. Spends 2. Equips the sword. It puts it on his Stoneforge Mystic, which will not die in a trade with a single Hawk. It will, of course, be able to be double blocked. Oh, so he's taking that back. He's like, well, a double block still does the same thing. Maybe what I want to do is put this on the Hawk and have my Hawk defend. Nope, he puts it on there, comes on in, and we see the double block from Dan Jordan, and he kills the equipped Hawk.
I think that's the right play there.
Just trying to make sure he taxes Dan Jordan's mana. And with the last of his mana, he casts another Hawk. And Dan Jordan allows it. Tapped out entirely. This is a big opportunity here for Dan Jordan, if he can capitalize.
He looks like he's in a really good position. I mean, I think at this point maybe David does start to protect against those swords, but obviously his only option to do that is with the Hawks here.
Over along the side, I see a Darwin Mess. You might know him as Darwin Castle, Hall of Famer, and creator of the Avalanche Rider.
So Dan Jordan drops a Jace the Mind Sculptor, brainstorms, and equips his Stoneforge Mystic with the Sword of Feast and Famine, doing the same kind of thing that that David did last turn.
Hey, Darwin. Darwin. Let's see. Pardon my little shout out there to Darwin. It's been a long time since I've seen Darwin Castle. David Shiels packing it up after
Jace the Mind Sculptor, kind of really putting a lot of pressure on David there. Dan already looking like he was in a commanding position, and then dropping the Jace just made things too much for David. But we're all tied up 1-1 here, going into Game 3 of the semifinals of the StarCityGames.com Open Series here in Boston. I'm Joey Pasco, here with Adrian Sullivan.
Hello, everybody.
Watching the Caw-Blade Mirror, and two really skilled players, too. Dan, unfortunately, just missed his 3rd land drop in Game 1.
Right,
and by the time he made his 3rd land drop, it was too late. And then Game 2, it looked to be the reverse, but David Shiels managed to find his 3rd land, but being a turn behind Dan was just too much for him.
Good to see you. Darwin just stopped by the booth to say hello, and then was curious what was going on here.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Darwin Castle, former Pro Tour regular great, one of the members of one of the most influential Magic the Gathering teams of all time, Year Move Games. But the thing is like many of the old school players, doesn't play much anymore, doesn't know about SCG Live, doesn't. It was like, oh wow, this is pretty cool. And he looked over at the screen that you're seeing right now, the matchup here between Dan and David. And I think it looked like he was pretty impressed by what we've got going on these days with Magic coverage.
Yeah, I think we may have found another viewer. Maybe.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, it's quite a difference from just a few years ago, really. I mean, you couldn't watch Magic on online live except for Pro Tour coverage and top 8s, really.
Yeah. I remember when Rashad did his first GG's Live, and I was like, this is a really cool idea. And then the thing is that's really interesting to me is that when it came to most of the coverage that I would be wanting to watch or to read or any of that, you know, Rashad and company, Rashad and friends, you know, I always feel like it's really literally the best seat in the house.
Yeah.
You know, for example, yesterday I went over there to watch one of the feature matches in round 9, and it's actually a better shot from right here with the cameras than it is being here live and watching them.
Yeah, I think it's a similar situation with watching sports. That's how I feel. Like I'm a big NFL fan, and people, you know, of course it's fun to go to the game, but it's an entirely different experience, and if you really want to see what's going on and understand what's happening, you're much better off watching it on TV.
Okay, now for this critical game 3, David Shiels is on the play.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a big advantage.
Now, one of the things to think about, if we go back to that second game, right? Dan Jordan's line of play where he goes, turn 2 Mystic, turn 3, don't activate the Mystic, but cast the Squadron Hawk. Now, that I think is the kind of de facto opening play if you have both of those cards. Just because of the turn 4, activate this is on the play, I mean.
Yeah, and this is
activate the Mystic, put the sword into play, equip it, attack. Right? I think that's the definitive line of play in general. But in talking about play skill issues, I think a lot of people that are playing the Quablade deck, they don't know that is one of the best lines of play you can do on the draw, or sorry, on the play.
Yeah, that's an extremely strong play, being able to set up your attacker with the sword. Just to being able to set things up for your sword to get through, or your hawk to get through with the sword. Really, it's the sword that you want to get through. The hawk is kind of irrelevant. It's just what's carrying it.
Nope. Well, yeah, I always do one shuffle on here. Well, don't make it be like I'm getting you. Alright, my play.
So besides people like Darwin Castle, who we saw here, some of the other old school players that I saw, Mike Bergoli. For those of you who are New England players, you might know Mike Bergoli, another member of kind of that New England mafia of players. I know that Melissa DeToro was here yesterday. I'm not sure if we saw Brian Lynch here.
I think he was here, but I don't know. Maybe I can't remember if I saw him or not yet.
Right.
Good call.
Brian Kibler, who only a few years ago we might have said, oh, that's an old school player who's showing up. But these days, he's already back.
Yeah.
You know, he's back, and he's basically he's hooked again. People quit the game, but I think once you get a little taste, it's so hard to actually leave. You know, the Surgeon General should put, you know, some sort of warning on the packs.
It is addictive. It's funny that you mentioned Kibler coming back to the game. I know just a couple of years ago there's a story of him playing, I think it was at a GP, and his match was seated near Patrick Chapin, and one of their opponents, I think, happened to, I guess, scoop and happened to look at the top couple cards, and there was some discussion between Brian and Patrick over whether or not that was a good idea or a bad idea, and the player they were talking to said, oh, well, I'm going to listen to Patrick because he's a pro.
That's an amazing story.
So
I love that. That's really good.
not
That's
knowing
really
who
good.
Brian Kubler was, because I guess, being that he was gone for so long, a lot of people didn't know who he was.
Yeah, I definitely know the sting of that in certain ways.
Don't you know who I am?
See, I'm not going to be the one that says that. I
Right.
definitely can think of certain people who have said things along that lines.
Yeah, I don't think Brian said that. I'm sure, but that's a story I've heard told several times. So
That's an
obviously
amazing
is,
story. I really like that. That's funny. That's really funny. I mean, it's funny too, because if you think about like a lot of things that happen in Magic, sometimes Magic players' renown is local. You
Yeah.
know? And like everyone that's local knows who this person is, and then you'll be like, oh yeah, I can't believe I lost to that scrub, blah blah blah, and they're like,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, who'd you lose to? And they'll say some name, and you're like, yeah, but that guy's a Grand Prix champion.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, I didn't realize. What
Did I
Grand
say
Prix did he
scrub?
won?
That's not what
Oh
I
yeah, well he won Grand Prix Denver 4 years ago. And
Yeah.
you're like, oh wow.
Right. That was
okay.
before I was playing,
Yeah.
or something.
I always like fetching on things you want.
Yeah, I definitely remember one of the things about some of these really, really great, people that you sometimes see show up. It's just they can walk by a match and just say something really insightful. The GG's live coverage of the Gen Con this year, Bob Maher just walked by a match and they brought him into the booth pretty quickly, and basically within about 30 seconds, he looking at just Sam Black's board. We did not have the face cameras yet. Just watching Sam Black's hand, like as in his fingers in the screen, he was like, "Yeah, Sam Black doesn't have it."
Wow.
And like we were like, "What do you mean?" Says the other person that was there. I'm watching at home.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, well, whenever this happens, that's a tell that Sam gives off that he doesn't have it." And I'm like,
That's nuts. They don't call him the Great One for nothing.
he's the great one. And we have opening Seachrome Coast into Preordain, looking at a couple of cards there.
I see another Preordain, a Glacial Fortress, I think a Sword of Feast and Famine.
Looks like he's got a solid set of mana, he's got a Spell Pierce, and there's a Jace and another Preordain.
Yeah.
I think there's at least one of those cards that's going to stand top, maybe both.
Yeah. Maybe I may have thought I saw a sword, but maybe it wasn't a sword.
I don't think he has a turn 2 play as part of the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's what he's digging for. That's what we were talking about. Well, you guys were talking about in the booth. I think I was standing next to it about the how Shaheen Sarani doesn't like Preordain in every deck, but he thinks in Cawblade it's very important.
He says it's right, yeah.
to search for that turn 2 play, and there's a
Yeah.
perfect example.
David Shiels buries the Jace and puts a Preordain on top. Seachrome Coast on the other side for Dan Jordan.
And pass the turn. So
And here,
draws
look at
his
that.
turn 2
There's
play.
a Mystic.
Nice top deck.
I think a lot, and he doesn't have that. I think the
Oh.
untapped land for
That's-
it. That,
yeah, he's got a
that
Glacial
Preordain
Fortress.
draws a Spell Pierce.
Yeah. So
Yeah, he has to. There's the delay. Now the funny thing is, I think a lot of players would have probably put that Jace and left it there on top, and
Yeah.
David Shiels knows that that's not what the fight is right now.
Yeah.
And so he buries it. I think that shows a lot of discipline. Here, that Tectonic Edge into Stoneforge Mystic for Dan Jordan. And now here, we're going to see David Shiels has a choice between Squadron Hawk and Stoneforge Mystic. I would be unsurprised if we saw the Stoneforge Mystic hit. However, that first Hawk is always so important. It could come down
Yeah.
too.
And David does have a Spell Pierce, but I don't think he has the third land drop to take advantage of it. So is this?
He's doing a little bit of digging, a little bit of digging. Aggressive play here by David Shiels. His
Yeah, he's
Preordain on turn 2,
digging.
aggressive.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
It is aggressive is the funny thing.
It's his turn 3 actually. He's
Berry,
digging for that
yeah,
third
turn
land.
3, you're right. Berry.
And,
He says go. Oh,
does not have a third land drop. So this is what happened to Dan in game 1, and now it's
Seachrome Coast, Preordain. Sure.
I see a Gideon, not in the top 2, but in his hand.
If there's a Squadron Hawk here,
Bottom.
then Dan has all the pieces he needs. He says
no,
go.
just-
He does
just
not have
one
that
on the
Squadron Hawk. There's a Squadron Hawk for David Shiels. No land though still. Oh, there's a big sigh there.
Yeah.
Kind of held back a little bit, but you can still feel the edge of it. Is it a Divine Offering?
I think so.
I think it's going to be a go. I think he's just going to say go and divine offer that sword.
Yeah, that he's expecting from Dan. No.
Okay.
Tries
I am
to-
not the master.
Apparently
Who is the master?
Edgar the Master Flores, I think, is the master, maybe, but
Very good. I guess that's okay.
so. And
There's a Squadron Hawks.
Squadron, yeah, there's that turn 4 play with the equip a sword, play a Squadron Hawk. In with the Stoneforge Mystic. So now David looks like he's trying to decide what he wants to do here, because I mean he can block here, but kind of undoes the work he did last turn, just trying to get something on the board.
Yeah, I guess that was 6 actually.
And we saw him last game having no fear of letting the sword in. But yeah, he decides to block this time.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
he
is that
topped up the colonnade?
There we go. And we got a divine offering for the sword while he's tapped out. Now this does mean that he is tapped out for Dan Jordan, who can lay a 5th mana. He can either Jace, or if he has the 5th mana, Gideon.
He has Gideon for sure. So there's
Crack it.
Scalding
There's the
Tarn.
Gideon. Oh, David Shields is in a rough position here.
Yeah.
In comes 2 damage.
I'll just hit you for 2. Although divine offering helps mitigate that damage a little bit, but not really what's important right now.
Depending on David Shields' hand, the Gideon might not be necessarily overwhelmingly scary, but it's still not something you're excited about.
Right. I mean, look at Dan's board. He's got Squadron Hawk, Stoneforge Mystic, Gideon to David's 3 lands, possibly 4 now. Yeah.
Mortar Pod.
Yeah, he does it. We haven't seen a 4th land yet.
I mean, let's pretend that that David has the best situation for him. If there's no sword, if there's no Jace, if it's just the Gideon, Condemn can take care of Gideon.
That's true. Yeah.
But there's a Sun Titan, so
Sun Titan gets back Sword of Feast and Famine.
oh man, this is a position where I don't know that there's much that you can do to get out of this problem.
I don't know how David comes back from something like this. There's his 4th land drop and his own Gideon, but 4 lands isn't going to do it there. So land.
Does the streak for David Shields end here?
If he can pull this out, it will be quite a feat.
I will call it epic.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
In
he
comes
is
a
going
Mortar
to-
Pod.
Yeah.
And down comes a Hawk.
So
Fetching some more
I
Hawks.
think he's grabbing 3 here. Believe he has 4 cards in hand. Think he just got 2 Hawks, looks like. So I was wrong maybe on the Hawk count. Or the hand count, one or the other. So Dan, equipping the sword to...
Somebody.
Yeah.
Anybody.
He's got plenty of options. So it looks like the Hawk picks up that sword.
The question is, does
David respond?
want to kill it?
Yeah, respond with the Mortar Pod. So
Nope.
no.
He says that's fine, with quote marks around fine.
Yeah. And was that?
David says
Scoop
that's
him
all
up.
I need to know. And you see that little look from Dan Jordan. He doesn't want to win that way.
Yeah.
I mean, he wants to win.
Of course,
No
yeah,
doubt
he
he
wants
wants
to.
to win. But what he wanted there is he wanted to have a match.